The retired firefighter stood on his front lawn, staring at the citation letter with disbelief etched across his weathered face. For 30 years he had run into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. He had saved lives, protected property, and served his community with unwavering dedication. Now, in his golden years, he found himself facing an adversary he never anticipated, his own Homeowners Association. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades navigating the chaos of emergency situations, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Yet here he was, being threatened with fines over something as trivial as the color of his mailbox or the height of his grass. This wasn't just about rules and regulations anymore. This was about respect, about recognizing the sacrifice of those who dedicated their lives to public service, and about the fundamental question of what truly matters in a community. The HOA board had always been strict, but their recent enforcement actions had taken on an almost vindictive quality. They seemed to have forgotten that neighborhoods are made up of people, not just properties. They had lost sight of the human element that makes a community thrive. The retired firefighter wasn't someone who sought conflict. His entire career had been built on teamwork, cooperation, and finding solutions under pressure. But something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every veteran, every retired public servant, every person who had given their best years to serving others, only to be treated like a nuisance in their own neighborhood. The citation represented something larger, the clash between rigid bureaucracy and common sense, between petty enforcement and human decency, between those who wield small amounts of power and those who have genuinely served with great responsibility. As word spread through the neighborhood about the firefighter's predicament, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had previously remained silent about HOA overreach started speaking up. They remembered the community barbecues where the firefighter had shared stories about his experiences, teaching children about fire safety with patience and humor. They recalled seeing him help elderly neighbors with yard work, never asking for anything in return. They thought about the times he had checked their smoke detectors, offered advice on emergency preparedness, and simply been a reassuring presence in uncertain times. This wasn't just any resident being targeted. This was someone who embodied the very spirit of community service that the HOA claimed to protect. The mounting frustration wasn't about defending rule-breaking. It was about defending proportionality, fairness, and the recognition that some people deserve the benefit of the doubt based on their character and contributions. The HOA president, however, remained unmoved. In her view, rules were rules and exceptions created dangerous precedents. She had built her tenure on strict enforcement, believing that property values and neighborhood aesthetics depended on unwavering adherence to regulations. She saw herself as the guardian of community standards, the person willing to make unpopular decisions for the greater good. But in her zealous pursuit of compliance, she had failed to consider the court of public opinion, the power of community sentiment, and the reality that not all rules serve their intended purpose equally in all situations. Her insistence on proceeding with fines against a retired firefighter, someone who had literally risked his life for others, revealed a troubling disconnect between authority and wisdom, between having power and knowing when to exercise it with discretion. The situation escalated when the HOA sent a second notice, this time threatening legal action and liens against the property. The firefighter felt the weight of injustice pressing down on him. After spending his career helping people during their worst moments, he never imagined he would need help himself in such an absurd situation. But he also knew something the HOA didn't. Communities have long memories, and they remember both kindness and callousness. He had built relationships throughout his decades of service, not for personal gain, but because that's who he was. Those relationships mattered now more than ever. As the conflict intensified, neighbors began organizing, creating social media groups, and discussing the situation at local coffee shops and grocery stores. The narrative was shifting from a simple compliance issue to a broader conversation about values, about what kind of community people wanted to live in, and about whether bureaucratic enforcement should ever override basic human decency and gratitude. What the HOA board failed to understand was that their actions weren't happening in a vacuum. Every decision they made was being observed, discussed, and judged by the very people they claimed to represent. The retired firefighter's situation had become a lightning rod for frustration that had been building for years. Frustration about excessive fees, about arbitrary enforcement, about a system that seemed designed to punish rather than support residents. People began questioning why their HOA fees kept increasing while basic services remained unchanged. They wondered why the board seemed more interested in citations than in fostering genuine community connections. They asked themselves whether the trade-off between property value protection and quality of life had tipped too far in the wrong direction. The firefighter had inadvertently become a symbol, a focal point for all these simmering concerns that had never quite found the right moment or the right person to rally around. Meanwhile, the retired firefighter consulted with former colleagues, many of whom were outraged on his behalf. Some suggested media involvement, others recommended legal action, but he remained hesitant to escalate further. His nature was to resolve conflicts, not to create them. Yet he also recognized that sometimes standing up against injustice requires uncomfortable action. He thought about all the times he had encouraged young firefighters to do what was right, even when it was difficult. He reflected on the values he had tried to live by throughout his career: integrity, courage, service, and accountability. Now those same values were being tested in a completely different arena. The question wasn't whether he could fight. His entire career had been a fight against chaos, destruction, and tragedy. The question was whether this particular fight was worth having, whether it would accomplish anything meaningful, or whether it would simply drain his energy during years that were supposed to be peaceful and rewarding after a lifetime of stress and sacrifice. The Homeowners Association meeting room buzzed with tension as residents filled every available seat, with many more standing along the walls. This wasn't the typical sparse attendance where a handful of board members made decisions in virtual isolation. Tonight was different. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the ongoing dispute between the HOA and the retired firefighter, and people had decided they could no longer remain passive observers. The retired firefighter himself sat quietly near the back, his presence both unassuming and powerful. He hadn't asked for this support, hadn't campaigned for allies, hadn't played the victim. But his decades of genuine service and authentic neighborliness had created a reservoir of goodwill that was now flowing in his direction. The board members shifted uncomfortably at the front table, suddenly aware that their usual procedural approach might not suffice for this particular evening. The HOA president called the meeting to order with her customary authoritative tone, but there was a subtle edge to her voice that betrayed underlying nervousness. She understood that tonight's proceedings would be scrutinized more carefully than any meeting in recent memory. She began with routine business: budget reports, landscaping contracts, upcoming maintenance projects. But the audience's restlessness was palpable. People hadn't come to hear about mulch deliveries and sprinkler repairs. They had come for the main event, the elephant in the room that everyone knew would eventually be addressed. As the president methodically worked through her agenda, refusing to be rushed, the tension in the room continued to build. Some residents exchanged knowing glances. Others checked their phones, documenting the meeting for social media, while a few simply stared at the board with barely concealed frustration. When the floor finally opened for resident comments, hands shot up immediately. The first speaker was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. She spoke about how the firefighter had personally helped her during a kitchen fire scare, arriving before the fire department and calmly guiding her to safety while ensuring the situation was under control. Her voice trembled with emotion as she questioned how an organization could harass someone who had proven himself to be such an asset to the community. Another resident, a young father, talked about the fire safety presentation the firefighter had given at the local elementary school, inspiring his daughter to create an emergency plan for their family. One by one, testimonials painted a picture of someone who had never stopped serving even after retirement. Someone who embodied the very ideals of good citizenship that the HOA supposedly existed to promote. The board members listened with varying degrees of receptiveness. Some appeared genuinely moved by the testimonials, perhaps reconsidering their stance. Others maintained stony expressions, committed to their position that rules must be enforced uniformly, regardless of circumstance. The president herself seemed caught between defending her authority and acknowledging the overwhelming sentiment in the room. She attempted to explain that the HOA's position wasn't personal, that they were simply following established guidelines, that exceptions would undermine the entire regulatory framework, but her words rang hollow against the passionate defenses of the firefighters' character and contributions. The crowd wasn't buying the argument that bureaucratic consistency mattered more than human compassion and common sense. They weren't persuaded that a minor violation, whatever it actually was, warranted the aggressive enforcement actions that had been taken. As the meeting progressed, the discussion evolved beyond this single case to address broader concerns about HOA governance. Residents questioned the board's priorities, asking why enforcement seemed to focus on minor aesthetic issues while more significant community needs went unaddressed. Someone pointed out that the playground equipment was aging and potentially unsafe, yet the HOA had allocated more resources to citation enforcement than to recreational improvement. Another resident highlighted how the board had rejected multiple proposals for community events that would bring neighbors together, citing liability concerns and administrative burdens. The retired firefighter's situation had opened a floodgate, allowing long-suppressed frustrations to pour forth. People who had previously accepted HOA decisions without question were now demanding transparency, accountability, and a fundamental reassessment of organizational values. The board president attempted to regain control of the meeting, invoking procedural rules about time limits and relevance. But the residents had found their voice, and they weren't going to be silenced by parliamentary procedure. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about power dynamics, about who gets to make decisions that affect everyone's lives, and about whether those in authority are truly serving the community or merely exercising control for its own sake. The firefighter himself had remained quiet throughout most of the meeting, allowing others to speak on his behalf, but when directly addressed, he stood and spoke with the calm authority that comes from years of leadership in high-pressure situations. He wasn't angry or defensive. He simply asked the board to consider whether their actions in this case reflected the kind of community they wanted to create, whether strict rule enforcement was more important than neighbor relationships, and whether there might be room for flexibility when circumstances warranted. His words resonated throughout the room not because they were eloquent or dramatic, but because they were authentic and grounded in genuine concern for community well-being. He wasn't arguing that rules don't matter or that he should receive special treatment. He was suggesting that wisdom involves knowing when strict adherence to regulations serves the community's interests, and when it actually undermines them. The distinction between being rule-driven and being principle-driven became increasingly clear as the discussion continued. The HOA had become so focused on enforcement mechanisms that it had lost sight of why those rules existed in the first place, to protect and enhance community life, not to make it more difficult or contentious. The meeting had become a referendum on competing visions of neighborhood governance, and the outcome would set a precedent that extended far beyond this single case. The morning after the contentious HOA meeting, the retired firefighter woke to dozens of messages on his phone. Neighbors were sharing updates, offering support, and discussing next steps. The local community Facebook group had exploded with activity overnight, with hundreds of comments debating HOA authority, property rights, and the treatment of public servants. What had started as a personal dispute had transformed into a neighborhood-wide conversation about governance and values. The firefighter scrolled through the messages with mixed emotions, gratitude for the support but also discomfort with being at the center of such controversy. He had never sought the spotlight during his career, preferring to do his job quietly and effectively. Yet here he was, thrust into a very public battle that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. What neither the firefighter nor the HOA board knew was that the story had already traveled beyond neighborhood boundaries. A local journalist who lived 3 blocks away had been following the situation closely, recognizing its broader implications for community governance issues that affected municipalities throughout the region. She had attended the previous night's meeting, taking detailed notes and recording residents' testimonials. By morning, she had crafted an article that captured both the specific details of this case and the larger questions it raised about homeowners associations, their increasing power, and the occasional disconnect between their actions and community sentiment. The article appeared on the local news website just before noon, complete with the firefighter's service record, interviews with neighbors, and responses from HOA board members who had agreed to comment. Within hours, the story was being shared across social media platforms, picked up by regional news outlets, and generating discussion far beyond the neighborhood's borders. The article's reach extended to City Hall, where Mayor Patricia Richardson was reviewing her daily news briefing. As she read about the retired firefighter's situation, something clicked in her mind. She remembered meeting him years ago at a ceremony honoring first responders. She recalled his humble demeanor, even as he received recognition for particularly heroic rescues. More importantly, she understood the symbolic significance of this conflict. Here was someone who embodied public service being harassed by a private governance body over what appeared to be trivial violations. The optics were terrible, but beyond optics there was a genuine question of whether the situation represented a broader problem with HOA oversight and accountability. The mayor had been hearing complaints about aggressive HOA enforcement in various neighborhoods, but those concerns had remained abstract until now. This case put a human face on the issue, and it was a face that commanded respect throughout the community. Mayor Richardson immediately called her chief of staff and requested a briefing on municipal authority regarding homeowners associations. The legal framework was complex. HOAs operated as private entities with significant autonomy, yet they also existed within municipal boundaries and were subject to certain state and local regulations. The mayor couldn't simply override HOA decisions, but she did have platforms, influence, and the ability to shine light on situations that deserved public scrutiny. She also had relationships with community leaders, media outlets, and other stakeholders who could help shift the narrative. After consulting with her team, she made a decision that would prove pivotal. She would personally visit the neighborhood, attend the next HOA board meeting, and address the situation directly. This wasn't typical mayoral protocol, but Richardson had built her political career on being accessible, on confronting problems directly, and on standing up for residents who couldn't always advocate effectively for themselves. The announcement that the mayor would attend the upcoming HOA meeting sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Board members scrambled to understand the implications, consulting with their attorney about protocols and potential legal ramifications. The president felt her carefully constructed authority suddenly threatened by the intrusion of municipal politics into what she considered private association business. Some board members, however, quietly welcomed the mayor's involvement, hoping it might provide an exit ramp from a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. Residents, meanwhile, were energized by the development. The mayor's attention validated their concerns and suggested that their voices had been heard beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. For the retired firefighter, the news brought both relief and anxiety. He appreciated the support, but worried about the spectacle the situation was becoming. He had always been uncomfortable with attention, preferring action to recognition, results to praise. When Mayor Richardson arrived at the community center for the meeting, she was accompanied by her chief of staff and the city's director of community relations, but notably, no security detail or press entourage. She wanted her presence to facilitate dialogue, not to intimidate or create a media circus. She greeted residents warmly as they entered, shaking hands and listening to quick summaries of their experiences with the HOA. When she spotted the retired firefighter, she approached him directly, thanking him for his years of service and expressing her concern about his current situation. Her genuine warmth and directness immediately set a tone that was both official and deeply human. She wasn't here as a distant authority figure, but as someone who genuinely cared about her constituents and the quality of community life in her city. The meeting began with the HOA president attempting to maintain her usual procedural control, but the mayor's presence had fundamentally altered the dynamics. Richardson waited patiently through the opening formalities before requesting an opportunity to address the board and residents. Her remarks were carefully calibrated. She acknowledged the important role that HOAs play in maintaining neighborhood standards and property values, recognized that boards are typically composed of volunteers doing their best to serve their communities, but also raised questions about proportionality, discretion, and the need for governance structures that balance rule enforcement with human compassion. She spoke about the firefighter's service record without making it seem like special pleading, framing it instead as part of a larger question about how communities recognize and value those who dedicate their lives to public service. She noted that cities succeed when various governance structures work in harmony rather than creating unnecessary conflict, and she offered the city's resources to help the HOA review its policies and enforcement procedures. What made the mayor's intervention particularly effective was her refusal to simply condemn the HOA board or demand a specific outcome. Instead, She elevated the conversation, asking board members and residents alike to consider what kind of community they wanted to create and whether current practices aligned with those aspirations. She shared examples from other neighborhoods where HOAs had successfully balanced enforcement with flexibility, where boards had developed reputation for fairness rather than rigidity. She suggested that the retired firefighter's case could become an opportunity for constructive change, rather than simply a conflict to be won or lost. Her approach gave board members a way to reconsider their position without appearing weak or capitulating to pressure. It created space for compromise and for preserving everyone's dignity while still addressing the core issues. The HOA president, who had entered the meeting defensive and determined to stand her ground, found herself responding to the mayor's framing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The mayor had skillfully recontextualized the situation, moving it from a binary question of rule enforcement versus special treatment to a more nuanced discussion about community values and governance philosophy. Other board members, sensing an opportunity to resolve the situation favorably, began asking questions about best practices and how other associations handled similar situations. The mood in the room shifted from confrontational to collaborative, from adversarial to problem-solving. Residents who had come prepared for battle found themselves instead participating in a genuine dialogue about improving HOA governance for everyone's benefit. The retired firefighter, watching this transformation, felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Regardless of the specific outcome for his case, something more important was happening. The community was coming together to define its values and to create systems that reflected those values. In the days following the mayor's appearance at the HOA meeting, the retired firefighter reflected on the unexpected journey that a simple citation had triggered. He sat on his porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children wait for school buses. This was the life he had envisioned for retirement. Peaceful, quiet, connected to community in positive ways. The recent conflict had disrupted that vision, but it had also revealed something profound about the neighborhood he called home. The support he had received wasn't just about defending him personally. It was about residents asserting their collective voice, about people deciding that they wanted to live in a community defined by compassion rather than rigid enforcement. The experience had been stressful, even painful at times, but it had also demonstrated the power of authentic relationships built over years of genuine service and neighborliness. The firefighter thought back to his early days in the fire service, when a veteran captain had told him something he'd never forgotten. Our job isn't just about fighting fires, it's about serving people, and that means seeing them as people, not just addresses or incident numbers. That philosophy had guided his entire career. He had approached every call with the understanding that behind every emergency was a human being experiencing one of the worst moments of their life. Whether it was a house fire, a medical emergency, or a car accident, his role was to provide not just technical expertise, but also calm reassurance and human connection. He had carried that same approach into retirement, continuing to see his neighbors as people deserving of kindness, assistance, and respect. The irony wasn't lost on him that the HOA board, in their zealous rule enforcement, had failed to see him in the same way, as a person with a history, with contributions, with circumstances that might warrant consideration. The contrast between the mayor's leadership approach and the HOA board's initial stance offered a masterclass in effective governance. Mayor Richardson had demonstrated that authority could be exercised with both firmness and flexibility, that taking a situation seriously didn't require rigidity, and that real leadership involves creating space for dialogue rather than simply imposing decisions. She had shown that acknowledging complexity wasn't weakness but wisdom, that considering context didn't undermine standards but actually reinforced their legitimacy. Her intervention had reminded everyone, board members and residents alike, that governance structures exist to serve people, not the other way around. When systems become more important than the humans they are meant to serve, when process supersedes purpose, when rules become weapons rather than guidelines, something fundamental has gone wrong. The mayor had recognized this imbalance and addressed it without humiliating anyone or creating permanent enemies. The retired firefighter also recognized his own role in how the situation had unfolded. His initial response to the citation had been disbelief and frustration, but he hadn't immediately escalated or responded aggressively. His temperament, shaped by decades of emergency management, had served him well. He had assessed the situation, gathered information, sought advice, and allowed the community response to develop organically rather than trying to control or manipulate it. This restraint had actually amplified his moral authority. People rallied to his defense precisely because he wasn't demanding it, wasn't playing the victim, wasn't making dramatic gestures for attention. His authenticity had shown through because it was genuine, not performed. This realization reinforced something he had always believed but perhaps hadn't fully articulated. The most powerful form of influence comes not from asserting yourself, but from consistently demonstrating character that makes others want to stand beside you. The HOA board had begun a process of self-examination that would have been impossible without the crisis. Several board members had privately approached the firefighter to apologize and to express their own frustrations with how the situation had been handled. They revealed that there had been internal disagreements about the aggressive enforcement approach, but that the board president's strong personality and procedural expertise had made it difficult to mount effective opposition. The mayor's intervention had created permission for dissenting voices to emerge, for alternative perspectives to be heard. The board announced that they would be conducting a comprehensive review of their enforcement policies, creating an appeals process for residents who felt citations were unwarranted, and establishing a community relations committee to better understand resident concerns before they escalated into conflicts. These weren't mere cosmetic changes. They represented a fundamental shift in how the association would relate to its members. For the firefighter, vindication came not in the form of a dramatic apology or public spectacle, but in something more meaningful. The citation was quietly withdrawn, classified as an administrative error that had been resolved through mutual understanding. No fines were assessed, no legal action was pursued, and no formal admission of wrongdoing was required from anyone. The resolution allowed everyone to save face while still achieving substantive change. Some neighbors felt this was too lenient, that the board should have been held more publicly accountable, but the firefighter was satisfied. He had never wanted revenge or humiliation for the board members. He had simply wanted fair treatment and recognition that circumstances matter. The resolution achieved those goals, while also catalyzing broader improvements that would benefit all residents. That seemed like a better outcome than a Pyrrhic victory that left lasting bitterness and division. The experience also deepened the firefighter's appreciation for the mayor's political skills and genuine commitment to constituent welfare. Richardson had taken a risk by involving herself so directly in what could have been dismissed as a private neighborhood dispute. If the situation had deteriorated, or if her intervention had been perceived as overreach, it could have damaged her political standing and complicated the city's relationship with homeowners associations throughout the municipality. But she had calculated that the potential benefits, demonstrating responsive leadership, addressing a legitimate governance concern, supporting a deserving constituent, outweighed the risks. Her judgment had proven sound, and she had emerged with enhanced credibility as a mayor who didn't just talk about community values but actively defended them when they were threatened. The firefighter made a mental note to attend her next town hall meeting and to thank her personally, away from cameras and public attention, in the way that felt most genuine. As life gradually returned to normal, the retired firefighter found himself reflecting on what the entire episode revealed about human nature, about power, about community, and about the values that truly matter. He thought about how easily people with limited authority can become intoxicated by it, how governance structures can drift away from their original purposes, how communities sometimes need catalyzing events to articulate their shared values. He also thought about resilience, his own and his neighbors', and about the importance of standing up for principle even when it's uncomfortable or uncertain. The retired firefighter never imagined that his stand against what seemed like petty bureaucratic harassment would spark a movement that extended far beyond his own neighborhood. Within weeks of the mayor's intervention and the resolution of his case, he began receiving messages from residents in other communities facing similar situations with their own homeowners association. Some were veterans being fined for displaying flags, others were elderly residents struggling to maintain their properties to increasingly rigid standards, and still others were families being threatened with liens over minor violations that seemed to exist solely to generate revenue. Each story followed a familiar pattern. well-meaning residents trying to live peacefully in their homes, suddenly finding themselves targeted by enforcement mechanisms that felt disproportionate and dehumanizing. The firefighter read these messages with a growing sense of responsibility. His personal situation had illuminated a systemic problem, and people were looking to him for guidance and advocacy. What struck him most powerfully about these communications was the emotional toll that HOA conflicts were taking on ordinary people. One retired teacher described having anxiety attacks every time she saw an envelope from her HOA in the mailbox, terrified of what new violation might be cited. A disabled veteran talked about the stress of maintaining yard standards that would be challenging for an able-bodied person, let alone someone with mobility limitations, and how the constant threat of fines had made his home feel like a prison rather than a sanctuary. A young couple shared how their dreams of home ownership had turned into a nightmare of arbitrary enforcement and mounting fees that were straining their budget. These weren't frivolous complaints from people trying to avoid reasonable community standards. These were legitimate grievances from residents who felt trapped in systems that had lost sight of their fundamental purpose. The firefighter recognized in these stories the same dynamics he had experienced: power exercised without wisdom, rules enforced without context, and governance structures that had become adversarial rather than collaborative. He also noticed a disturbing pattern in how HOA boards responded to challenges. In case after case, boards doubled down on aggressive enforcement when questioned, treating any resistance as a threat to their authority that must be crushed. They hired attorneys to send intimidating letters. They imposed escalating fines that quickly became financially devastating, and they used foreclosure threats as weapons to compel compliance. The asymmetry of power was staggering. Individual homeowners facing legal fees they couldn't afford, fighting organizations that used collective dues to fund aggressive legal strategies. Many residents simply capitulated, not because they believed the enforcement was fair, but because they lacked the resources to fight. Those who did resist often found themselves ostracized, their complaints dismissed as troublemaking, their concerns minimized by boards that had insulated themselves from meaningful accountability. The retired firefighter understood that his own situation had turned out relatively well, largely because of circumstances beyond his control: a mayor willing to intervene, neighbors who rallied vocally, and media attention that created pressure for resolution. Most people facing similar situations had none of those advantages. The experience prompted him to think more deeply about power structures in contemporary American communities. Homeowners associations had proliferated over recent decades, with millions of Americans now living under their governance. Originally conceived as mechanisms for maintaining shared amenities and protecting property values, many had evolved into something quite different. Many governments with significant coercive power, but often minimal democratic accountability. Board elections typically attracted little participation, allowing small groups of motivated individuals to gain control and exercise authority that affected hundreds or thousands of residents. The legal frameworks governing HOAs varied by state, but generally granted them broad enforcement powers while providing limited avenues for residents to challenge decisions. The retired firefighter wasn't opposed to HOAs in principle. He understood that community standards and maintenance of common areas required some governance structure. But he increasingly believed that the balance between organizational authority and individual rights had tilted dangerously in the wrong direction. His growing understanding of these systemic issues led him to conversations with local legislators who were beginning to examine HOA reform. One state representative who had received numerous constituent complaints about aggressive HOA enforcement reached out to the firefighter to discuss his experience and gather his insights about potential legislative remedies. They talked about the need for clearer appeals processes, for limits on fine amounts and escalation, for protections for residents acting in good faith, and for greater transparency in HOA operations. The legislator was drafting a bill that would create a state-level ombudsman office to investigate HOA disputes and mediate resolutions before they escalated to expensive legal battles. The firefighter found himself becoming an informal advisor on the legislation, providing the perspective of someone who had lived through the experience and understood both the practical and emotional dimensions of the problem. He was careful not to advocate for eliminating HOA authority entirely. That would be unrealistic and would create its own problems, but rather for introducing accountability mechanisms and proportionality requirements that would prevent the worst abuses. The media attention that his case had generated also created opportunities for broader public education about HOA governance issues. A local television station invited him to participate in a panel discussion about homeowners associations, their role in communities, and the challenges they presented for residents. He accepted reluctantly, still uncomfortable with public attention, but motivated by the realization that his platform could benefit others facing similar situations. The panel included an attorney specializing in HOA law, a community development expert, and a current HOA board president from a different neighborhood. The discussion was remarkably civil, with all participants acknowledging both the legitimate purposes of HOAs and the problems that could arise when governance went awry. The firefighter spoke about his experience without rancor, focusing on the systemic issues rather than personal grievances. He emphasized that most board members were volunteers trying to do their best for their communities, but that even well-intentioned people could lose perspective when given unchecked authority. He also noted that enforcement-focused governance created adversarial relationships that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened communities. What surprised him most during this period was discovering how many current and former firefighters, police officers, military veterans, and other public servants had faced similar conflicts with their HOAs. There seemed to be something about the public service mentality, a focus on mission over minutia, on substance over form, on responding to genuine needs rather than fixating on superficial compliance, that sometimes clashed with HOA culture. Or perhaps it was simply that these individuals had confronted real crises, actual emergencies, life and death situations, which gave them a different perspective on what truly mattered. When you've pulled people from burning buildings or responded to traumatic incidents, it's difficult to get worked up about mailbox colors or lawn ornaments. This observation didn't mean that public servants should be exempt from community standards, but it did suggest that governance systems should have enough flexibility to recognize that different people bring different perspectives, and that diversity of viewpoint strengthens rather than threatens communities. The retired firefighter also spent considerable time thinking about what had made Mayor Richardson's intervention so effective, and what lessons might be extracted for resolving similar conflicts in the future. Her approach had combined several key elements: genuine empathy for all parties involved, a focus on systemic issues rather than just the immediate dispute, the use of moral authority rather than heavy-handed legal power, and the creation of space for face-saving compromise rather than demanding complete capitulation from anyone. She had understood that the goal wasn't to humiliate the HOA board, but to reorient their thinking, not to eliminate their authority, but to encourage them to exercise it more thoughtfully. This nuanced approach had allowed for resolution and reform without creating permanent enemies or deepening divisions. The firefighter wondered how many conflicts, not just HOA disputes but all kinds of community tensions, might be resolved more constructively if leaders consistently applied these principles, rather than defaulting to adversarial winner-takes-all approaches. He began to see connections between effective conflict resolution and the principles that had guided his firefighting career. In emergency situations, successful outcomes required rapid assessment, clear communication, coordination among multiple parties with different roles and expertise, and the ability to adjust strategies based on changing circumstances. The goal was always to solve the actual problem, not to assign blame or prove who was right. Egos had to be suppressed in favor of mission accomplishment. These same principles, he realized, could transform governance at all levels if people were willing to embrace them. The HOA conflict that had disrupted his peaceful retirement had become something unexpected: an education in civic engagement, community organizing, and the possibilities for constructive change when people refuse to accept dysfunction as inevitable. He found himself unexpectedly energized by this new phase of service, different from his firefighting career but connected to the same fundamental commitment to helping people and strengthening communities. The transformation of the HOA board following the mayor's intervention and the resolution of the firefighter's case was neither instantaneous nor complete, but it was genuine and increasingly evident as weeks turned into months. The board president, who had initially embodied the rigid enforcement approach that created the crisis, surprised many by embracing the opportunity for reform rather than resigning in bitterness or digging in defensively. She issued a letter to all residents acknowledging that the board's approach had been overly aggressive and insufficiently attentive to individual circumstances, and she committed to working collaboratively with a newly formed resident advisory committee to review and revise enforcement policies. This wasn't an easy admission for someone who had prided herself on strong leadership and consistent rule application, but it demonstrated a capacity for growth and self-reflection that earned her a measure of respect, even from residents who had been most critical of her previous actions. The Resident Advisory Committee that emerged from this process became a model for constructive community engagement. The retired firefighter was invited to serve on it, along with a diverse cross-section of neighbors representing different ages, family situations, lengths of residence, and perspectives on HOA governance. The committee's mandate was to review existing rules and enforcement procedures, gather input from the broader community, and make recommendations for changes that would balance the legitimate need for community standards with greater flexibility, proportionality, and humanity. The first few meetings were somewhat tense, with years of accumulated frustrations and competing philosophies about neighborhood governance bubbling to the surface. Some committee members wanted to drastically curtail HOA authority, essentially gutting most enforcement mechanisms, while others worried that too much loosening of standards would lead to neglect and declining property values. The retired firefighter found himself playing an unexpected mediating role, using the same de-escalation skills he had employed in emergency situations to help people hear each other and find common ground. One of the committee's most important early decisions was to conduct a comprehensive survey of all residents, asking about their experiences with the HOA, their priorities for the community, their concerns about current governance, and their suggestions for improvement. The response rate was remarkable. Over 70% of households participated, suggesting a hunger for meaningful involvement in community decisions. The results were illuminating and sometimes surprising. Residents consistently ranked fair and reasonable enforcement as more important than strict compliance with all rules. They valued aesthetic standards but wanted them applied with common sense and with consideration for individual circumstances like health issues, financial hardship, or temporary situations. They wanted clearer communication about expectations and earlier, friendlier notification before citations were issued. Many expressed a desire for the HOA to focus more energy on building community connections and less on policing violations. There was strong support for creating mechanisms for residents to appeal citations they believed were unfair, and for establishing clearer guidelines about what would and wouldn't be enforced. Armed with this data, the advisory committee began the painstaking work of policy revision. They started with the enforcement procedures themselves, proposing a graduated approach that began with friendly notifications, progressed to written warnings, and only imposed fines after repeated violations and failed attempts at voluntary compliance. They recommended establishing an independent appeals panel composed of residents not currently serving on the board, ensuring that homeowners had a fair venue for contesting citations without having to appeal to the same people who had issued them. They suggested capping fine amounts and eliminating the escalating penalties that had sometimes resulted in residents owing thousands of dollars for relatively minor violations. They proposed creating hardship exemptions for elderly residents, people with disabilities, and those experiencing financial difficulties, allowing temporary relief from certain standards while working toward compliance. These weren't radical proposals designed to eliminate accountability, but rather thoughtful adjustments aimed at making governance more proportionate and humane. The process also revealed something important about community dynamics and human motivation. When residents felt they were being heard, when they had meaningful input into decisions affecting their lives, when governance was presented as collaborative rather than adversarial, their attitudes shifted dramatically. People who had been cynical about the HOA and resentful of its authority became engaged participants in improving it. Neighbors who had barely known each other before the crisis formed friendships through working together on the advisory committee or attending community forums about proposed changes. The retired firefighter observed this transformation with satisfaction that went beyond his personal vindication. This was genuine community building, the kind of authentic connection and shared purpose that made neighborhoods more than just collections of houses. He reflected on how much energy had been wasted on conflict and enforcement that could have been directed toward these positive community-building activities if the governance approach had been different from the beginning. The revised policies that eventually emerged from this process and were adopted by the HOA board represented a significant philosophical shift. The new enforcement guidelines explicitly stated that the purpose of community standards was to enhance quality of life and protect property values, and that enforcement actions should be evaluated against those core purposes rather than applied mechanically. Board members were directed to consider context, circumstances, and proportionality in all enforcement decisions. The new rules created multiple off-ramps for residents to achieve compliance without incurring financial penalties, emphasizing cooperation over punishment. A new mission statement for the HOA emphasized fostering community, maintaining common areas, protecting property values through reasonable standards, and serving the interests of all residents rather than just enforcing rules. These might seem like subtle changes, but they reflected a fundamental reorientation from an enforcement agency mentality to a service organization mentality. The retired firefighter watched these developments with a complex mix of emotions. He was gratified that his difficult experience had catalyzed positive change, pleased that future residents might be spared similar conflicts, and impressed by how many neighbors had stepped up to participate in the reform process. But he also felt a lingering sadness about the unnecessary stress and division that had preceded these improvements. If the board had approached his situation differently from the beginning, if they had started with a conversation rather than a citation, if they had been willing to exercise discretion and consider circumstances, none of the conflict would have been necessary. The positive outcomes didn't erase the fact that the crisis could have been avoided entirely with better initial judgment. This realization reinforced for him the importance of getting governance right from the start, of building in accountability and flexibility from the beginning, rather than waiting for crises to force reforms. He also thought about the role that his own background and relationships had played in the relatively positive resolution. He had decades of community goodwill, neighbors who knew and respected him, professional experience that had taught him how to navigate difficult situations, and enough emotional stability to avoid escalating conflicts counterproductively. The mayor's intervention had been crucial, but was itself partly a result of his history of public service. He wondered what happened to residents facing similar situations who lacked those advantages, people new to the neighborhood without established relationships, people without professional backgrounds in crisis management, people whose service to community had been quieter and less publicly recognized. Would they receive the same support and achieve similar outcomes? The question troubled him because he suspected the answer was often no, which suggested that systemic reforms were even more important than individual case resolutions. The experience had also deepened his understanding of what community truly means and requires. It's not just people living in proximity following the same rules and maintaining similar aesthetic standards. Real community involves knowing your neighbors, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating successes together, and creating space for genuine human connection that transcends property values and covenant compliance. The HOA conflict had paradoxically strengthened community bonds by forcing residents to clarify their values and work together toward shared goals. But sustainable community requires ongoing attention and effort, not just crisis-driven mobilization. When the retired firefighter's challenge gained traction, the HOA board found itself under a spotlight it had never anticipated. What had once been quiet, internal decisions now faced public scrutiny, and every document, email, and policy was suddenly subject to questions that demanded clarity. Board members who were accustomed to issuing notices without pushback began feeling the pressure as residents requested meeting transcripts, enforcement records, and proof that fines had been applied consistently. The board's confidence faltered as inconsistencies emerged, missing inspection logs, vague rule interpretations, and procedures that appeared to change depending on who was involved. Some members became defensive while others attempted to distance themselves from prior decisions, revealing cracks in the board's cohesion. They held emergency meetings behind closed doors, hoping to regain control, yet the more they tried to contain the situation, the more the community noticed their evasiveness. Emails that once went unanswered were suddenly met with rushed explanations as the board attempted to preserve its authority. The presence of city officials intensified the panic. Discussions that were once routine now carried a sense of urgency, as they feared the potential consequences of improper enforcement. Their actions shifted from confident directives to cautious, carefully worded responses, signaling that even they knew the foundation beneath their decisions was more fragile than they had admitted. Retired firefighter's story inspires nationwide support. As news of the dispute spread beyond the neighborhood, people from nearby towns and eventually across the country began reacting to the retired firefighter's story. His calm, principled stance resonated with individuals who had faced similar frustrations with homeowners associations, igniting a wave of empathy and admiration. Social media posts captured the quiet strength of a man who had spent his life protecting others and was now forced to defend his own rights. Comments poured in from those who admired his refusal to be intimidated, many sharing their own experiences with overreaching boards and offering encouragement. Local reporters picked up the story, portraying him as a symbol of fairness and resilience. The firefighter never sought attention, yet the authenticity of his struggle struck a powerful chord with audiences who felt empowered by his courage. Neighbors who had remained silent began stepping forward, emboldened by the growing support. People who had never met him sent messages of gratitude, recognizing in him the spirit of someone who believed deeply in doing what was right. The momentum grew naturally, fueled by a collective desire for accountability and transparency, transforming his situation into something far larger than a single dispute. As the conflict deepened, the neighborhood began to recognize that this wasn't just about one fine, but about the larger principle of fairness. What started as a single homeowner's stand quickly evolved into a collective movement as residents grew more aware of how easily power could be misused when no one questioned it. People who had previously stayed quiet found their voices, attending meetings, submitting statements, and demanding transparency with a confidence that hadn't existed before. The retired firefighter's determination became the spark that awakened a sense of unity, reminding everyone that a community gains strength when individuals support one another instead of facing challenges alone. The mayor declares the fine invalid, victory for common sense. When the mayor stepped forward and officially invalidated the fine, it marked a turning point that resonated throughout the entire neighborhood. The decision brought a wave of relief not only to the retired firefighter, but to every resident who had watched the situation unfold and hoped for justice. The mayor's involvement lent legitimacy to concerns that had long gone unheard, and his clear, decisive action demonstrated that accountability still held weight. The multa served as a powerful reminder that fair leadership can restore trust, and that standing up for what is right can influence even those in positions of authority. The moment the mayor's ruling became public, the dynamic within the neighborhood shifted dramatically. Residents who had watched the situation unfold with quiet frustration now felt emboldened to raise their own concerns, and those concerns came in waves. What had once been whispered conversations on sidewalks and over fences turned into organized discussions, petitions, and calls for formal accountability. The HOA board, once confident in its authority, found itself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of voices demanding explanations. Meetings that previously attracted only a handful of attendees now filled every seat, with people standing in the back eager to witness whether the board would acknowledge the growing unrest. The retired firefighter sat among them, not as a lone figure fighting a personal battle, but as a catalyst for a movement that had taken on a life of its own. The pressure built steadily as residents recounted their own experiences, small fines that had felt unfair, warnings that seemed arbitrary, and interactions that left them feeling dismissed rather than supported by the very board meant to represent them. Each testimony added weight to the growing demand for change. Local media continued covering the developments, intensifying scrutiny, and making it impossible for the HOA to hide behind closed doors. Letters poured in from homeowners of nearby communities who sympathized deeply, offering not just support but documentation of similar battles in their own neighborhoods. It became increasingly clear that the issue extended far beyond a single dispute. It reflected a recurring pattern of authority exercised without adequate checks or empathy. The board attempted several strategies to manage the backlash. At first, they tried issuing carefully worded statements emphasizing their commitment to the community, hoping to appear reasonable without admitting fault. But the statements lacked specifics and failed to address the central concerns raised by residents. People recognized empty reassurances when they heard them, and the board's vague responses only deepened distrust. When that approach faltered, the board shifted to procedural explanations, citing bylaws, enforcement policies, and administrative guidelines as though technical language could overshadow the emotional impact of their decisions. Yet the more they tried to deflect with formality, the more residents saw the avoidance beneath the surface. Finally, with participation swelling and the mayor's involvement underscoring the seriousness of the matter, the board could no longer ignore the need for a direct response. Under mounting pressure, and with more homeowners stepping forward each day, the board scheduled a special meeting. The turnout was larger than anything the neighborhood had witnessed. People arrived early, filling every seat and lining the walls, a silent but powerful reminder that the board's decisions affected a community far more unified and attentive than it had realized. When the board members entered, the room fell into a heavy, expectant quiet. Gone was the confident posture they once carried. Instead, their expressions revealed unease, the recognition that the old ways of operating without consequence were no longer viable. After several tense moments, the board president finally stood and delivered what many had doubted they would ever hear: an apology. It was not perfectly phrased nor emotionally eloquent, but it acknowledged the board's missteps, the lack of clear communication, and the need to rebuild trust. The retired firefighter listened with a calm steadiness, knowing the apology had been earned, not through hostility, but through persistent truth and collective strength. For the community, the apology was more than a symbolic gesture. It marked a shift in how the HOA would be expected to operate going forward. It signified recognition that homeowners were not subjects to be dictated to, but active participants deserving respect, clarity, and fairness. Residents left the meeting feeling a mixture of relief and empowerment, aware that their voices had made a difference and that change was possible when people stood together. Neighborhood restored, and a hero's legacy reaffirmed. In the weeks following the apology, the neighborhood began to settle into a renewed sense of harmony. The tension that had once lingered in the air gradually faded, replaced with a quiet optimism that things were finally being set right. The retired firefighter resumed his daily routines, tending to his yard with a deeper appreciation for the peace he had fought to protect. Neighbors who had followed his journey often stopped to thank him, not with dramatic gestures but with heartfelt sincerity. Simple acknowledgments of the courage it took to challenge a system that many feared, resented, but rarely confronted. His home, once the center of a dispute, became a symbol of unity. Children waved at him as they rode their bikes past. Older residents brought him homemade desserts as small tokens of gratitude. Others shared their personal stories of past frustrations, expressing relief that someone had finally been willing to stand firm. Each interaction underscored how deeply his actions had resonated, not because he sought recognition but because he embodied the quiet strength people admired. His determination reminded the community that fairness wasn't something granted, it was something defended through resilience and collective support. Meanwhile, the HOA began implementing changes, subtle at first, then more substantial as the board recognized the necessity of rebuilding trust. Transparency improved. Notices became clearer and were accompanied by explanations rather than commands. Inspections were documented properly, and residents were encouraged to ask questions rather than discouraged from doing so. Even the tone of communication softened, reflecting a genuine effort to correct the rigidity that had caused so much conflict. The retired firefighter observed these shifts with cautious optimism, recognizing that meaningful change required consistent follow-through, not just promises. Still, he appreciated the progress and the willingness of the board to learn from its missteps. Beyond the neighborhood, his story continued circulating, inspiring other communities to evaluate their own HOA practices. Online forums, local newsletters, and community meetings referenced the incident as an example of how everyday individuals could bring about constructive reform. People admired the dignity with which he handled the situation, never resorting to hostility, never seeking attention, but standing firmly in truth. His legacy grew quietly, rooted in integrity rather than spectacle. For him, the real reward was not the praise, but the knowledge that fairness had been restored, and that his neighbors felt empowered to advocate for themselves. Even as life returned to normal, the impact of the events lingered in meaningful ways. The retired firefighter found himself more connected to his community than ever before, not because he became a public figure, but because he earned trust through actions that reflected a lifetime of service. He had once protected people from flames and collapsing structures. Now he had protected them from an invisible but powerful force, unquestioned authority, and though he never sought to lead, his example naturally filled that role, guiding others to recognize their own ability to shape the environment they lived in. The neighborhood itself felt transformed. People were more engaged, more communicative, and more willing to address issues before they escalated. Block gatherings became more frequent, not as intentional activism, but as neighbors rediscovering the value of community. What had once been a group of individuals living near one another evolved into a supportive network grounded in mutual respect. The dispute that had once threatened to divide them instead strengthened their unity, proving that adversity can give rise to growth when met with courage and compassion. In this renewed harmony, the retired firefighter's contribution became part of the neighborhood's identity. His story was retold, not as a tale of conflict, but as a reminder of how one person's determination can safeguard the well-being of many. His legacy was not measured in headlines or public statements, but in the small, meaningful changes that shaped daily life. Clearer policies, kinder communication, and a community more connected than ever before.